That's great. Thank you so much, guys. Next week, we're going to be looking at Camus' The Stranger. So, Albert Camus' life. This is a picture of Albert Camus when he was a boy. Does anybody else remember any of the other existentialist philosophers we've looked at in here whose fathers died at a very young age? Camus also really loved to play football. After many years, during which I saw many things, what I know most surely about morality and the duty of man I owe to sport. But this is an image of the streets of French Algeria at the time when Camus was around, really gorgeous. He's stating directly and clearly what is being stated obliquely or indirectly in the outside. Crabs don't walk forward like this, they walk sideways. After the birth of his children, and he continued to actually publicly denounce the entire institution of marriage. In 1957, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. On the 4th of January 1960, at age 46, 3 years after he received the Nobel Prize in Literature, he died in a car accident. This is a picture from that car accident. So that's really the life of Albert Camus. Does anybody have any questions?
What you're mentioning about libertarianism, is that left libertarianism that you write about? Or
say it one more time. Is it left libertarianism or right?
Right libertarianism?
Yeah, it would be considered, right. It would be right libertarianism.
But I think that he was more inclined to R&D.
Well, I guess it depends on exactly what you mean. Generally, when we talk about the left, what we might be talking about is a kind of socialistic structure that's providing things like free healthcare, free education, etc. And he actually did not like these things.
I think that his death is one of the ways of living his philosophy.
I would like to talk about Homer's Myth of Sisyphus. So, the Myth of Sisyphus is a traditional Greek myth. The gods are not like these perfect, omniscient, amazing beings, but they actually carry a lot of the same prejudices and biases and weaknesses of human beings. For Sisyphus, he was really deceitful. He would cheat people out of money all the time, and he would actually he would pretty often kill travelers and guests. Zeus ordered Death. Death is a character here. Death is a person, or Death is a god, right? Zeus ordered Death to chain Sisyphus in the underworld as a punishment for being so deceitful, for killing all of these people, for doing a really terrible job at being a king. But Sisyphus had a trick up his sleeve. So Sisyphus had asked Death if he could test the chains. Death said, all right, yeah, I proved it. These chains are really strong. I cannot get out. And Sisyphus walked away. Of course, there were problems. People on Earth couldn't die. Animals couldn't die. On the left here, we have another rendering of the story of Sisyphus. This is from the 16th century by Titian. People in war who would be, shot down, well, not shot, but I guess slain with a sword in war, and then would just go home. People would get run over by a chariot and just walk away. People just weren't able to die. And this really enraged the gods. So they punished him. And how did they punish him? Well, they made him roll a huge boulder up a steep hill. Just before it would get to the very top, it would just escape the reach, the grasp of Sisyphus, and it would roll back down the mountain. So Sisyphus was condemned to endlessly be rolling this boulder up a mountain that would only fall back down. want to get too morbid here, but we are talking about a pretty damn serious topic. Does anybody in the audience know what the rates of suicide in Vietnam are? Yeah, Machan?
So I did some not research, just some quick search on articles, and there's this doctor that he says that there are 400,000 cases every year, and the cases for traffic accident is 13,000.
13,000 traffic accidents.
So 13,000 traffic accidents, but 400,000 cases of suicide.
There is a real stigma, there's a real shame around having a family member commit suicide.
The difference with suicide in the East and the West. For example, like people would kill themselves for the king. The king would just say, "You need to kill yourself." Like the kamikazes in World War II, willing to die for their leader, who they consider a god. And in the West, it seems suicide is committed for a lack of meaning.
Amazing.
In the East, it gives you meaning.
The only people who commit to suicide in the ancient Eastern Asia region, they are intellectuals.
It's often considered to be a luxury, the ability to commit suicide, because you need a certain freedom from just fighting the standard fight of life. You're just fighting to survive. It's only when you have a certain level of economic prosperity that you can begin to ask these questions. So now, I would actually like to pass the microphone over to Matt, and he's actually going to be breaking down Camus' interpretation of the story of the Myth of Sisyphus for us. Can I get a round of applause for Matt?
Part 1. Absurdity as a whole. Life is not absurd, the absurd is life. So Camus thinks basically that absurdity emerges from the tension between human reason, which would be individual subjective experience. We can assume that these are separate things. There's no absurdity within that world. And then there's the objective world itself, things that science describes. AC, fan, lights. There's no absurdity in this. But when human reason tries to graft its desires and its wants onto the objective world, in the middle space is where absurdity is born.
For Camus, absurdity was not a condition that was being judged.
Human reason, so historically it's been provided by religion. Religion has told you how to value what the grand scheme of life is leading toward, and it gives you a very fixed and meaningful sense of meaning. Absurd art, picture of absurd art on the right-hand side, and a quote. What is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the world longing for clarity, whose call echoes in the human heart. The absurd depends as much on man as on the world. The absurd is not in man nor in the world, but in their present together. Prior to thinking, you have an absurd feeling, and then you have absurd reasoning, and then consequences. There are 3 consequences that he describes. One is suicide. You judge that the world is not, it's meaningless, it's valueless, and you wish to end it. And there's hope, which is you disregard your absurd reasoning, the feeling and the thinking you had that life is absurd, because you have a blind faith. He thinks these 2 are evasions of the problem. They don't solve the problem. He advocates a 3rd way, which is called living with it, which is trying to maintain the tension that gives birth to absurdity.
From what I understand, this is Camus' major argument against suicide. If you kill yourself, you're still just running away from the problem. The answer would be the middle path. So this is the process of making a mandala. So they're starting this process with sifting out the sand, many different colors of sand. Many of you may have seen this in the past, these wild ceremonies in the creation of a mandala. All of this effort, all of this meticulous work. Has anyone ever seen a mandala created by Tibetan monks before? Yeah, by sand.
Blow them away.
Well, yeah.
Day or so.
Spoiler alert. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it's fine. I mean, I think they assumed it was getting that. So you see, they lay each one of these little grains of sand by hand And the amount of focus, persistent dedication to just the creation, holding their breath to not accidentally blow. And here it's complete. And sometimes after weeks of the creation of this mandala, this big public ceremony, at the very end, they rub the center and they begin to destroy it. Why? Well, you could make the argument here that it's embracing this middle way. I don't want to make too much of an allegory between Buddhism here and Sisyphus. Although, damn it, that sure is what I'm doing. Yeah.
Okay, so Camus gives 3 reasons that Sisyphus is an absurd hero to him. One is he shows scorn for the gods. He angers Zeus. He angers like 3 or 4, Death or Thanatos. He angers a few of the gods. He's not concerned with the amount of power that they have. He has a hatred of death. He chains them up, and then he escapes Hades, and he lives until a ripe old age. Yeah, and then he's also passionate about life. Discussion. Compare and contrast nihilism, existentialism, and absurdism. With which do you identify?
I guess you find your own reason. So then you don't necessarily accept that there is no reason, but you go into the
Well, you accept that there's no intrinsic reason. There's no set reason. You're open
like
to
no
find
general.
your own. Yeah, exactly.
But then that becomes for each
You
individual like
create
general.
your own.
Yeah.
From
So then
scratch, from nothing. You create your own
Yeah.
meaning. That's what existentialism is. There's nothing out there, you just...
Existentialism says that we can create meaning in our own life. And we can do this by focusing on something like, let's say, rock climbing, or chess, or God. We create the meaning. The meaning is not intrinsic to the universe. We create it. Number 3, absurdism says there's no intrinsic meaning in the universe. Same thing. Instead of what Camus refers to as hope, instead of taking a leap of faith and inventing meaning for ourselves, instead, we can just accept that we want there to be meaning and there is no meaning. We don't distract ourselves from it. Yeah.
So is it like using old dogmas to rationalize a new dogma? So if you were told that by religions that life is meaningful, and then you decide to say, oh well, okay, life is meaningless. Well, I have to find something. Otherwise, I'm just going to go crazy.
Right, but the absurdists would not accuse religion as being the reason for the existence of this desire for meaning, but would say that it's just intrinsic to human beings that we desire to find meaning in the world. Right? I mean, there's a real evolutionary argument here that Camus did not get into. Right, but then it's like maybe it's evolutionarily advantageous for human beings to have hardwired into our brain a desire to find meaning in the world. So he's not saying that this is something that was given to us by a religion, and now we have to fill this void since religion's absence. Instead, it's just saying this is something that humans have always needed. Religion used to fill this void. Now religion's not here, and the void is returned. This is pretty great, and I think it'll give us a nice close. So I'd like to have Matt break this down for 2 or 3 minutes. And then we can have this for our closing big group discussion. Okay.
Yeah, this is just like a cluster of ideas, acts, and feelings that Camus tries to, in trying to understand why people, the process of committing suicide, I guess. What are the ideas that motivate the people? How are the ideas related to the physical act itself? Does one necessarily cause the other? So he says these 2 ideas are linked. The feeling of absurdity. You're, working in the factory, you get this feeling, why am I doing this routine, monotonous thing? You become aware of it. That's linked to the idea, life is meaningless. There is no meaning. That's one section. And then you have these cluster of ideas, the act, the behavior of suicide, a physical act ending your life. And the idea that supposedly motivates it, being that life is not worth living. And then how do these two sections relate to each other? Does one necessarily lead to the other? If not, how are they related?
This is a kind of opportunity to critique the logic or the thought process of Camus here. Do you buy his argument here that absurdism is an answer to the question of whether or not we should kill ourselves?
Necessary thing which we're all propelled to do, because if you don't understand the world, you don't survive. So people that don't have this programmed in them strongly enough, this evolutionary will to survive, they will be more easily pulled towards the side of, I guess then, well, I don't understand life, and it makes me feel really bad, and I also don't really have the desire to live. Then you would kind of drop into the trap of suicide.
Yeah. So cool. Yeah. One topic that we didn't really get to discuss tonight is the joy, or really Camus uses the word happiness here, but is the happiness that is felt as a response to adopting absurdism as a lens through which to see the world. And this is the reason why we must see Sisyphus as smiling as he's rolling up the balls, because if he adopted this absurdist point of view, then he's actually doing, and like he's really happy with it.
How is the idea of a smiling Sisyphus different from existentialism? Because existentialism is getting lost in a thing that you create, a meaning that you've created yourself. But to me, that just sounds exactly like what existentialism says.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, cool. Camus would still consider that coming up with any kind of meaning, coming up with any meaning in your life, is still a way just to avoid the lack of meaning. But absurdism is to embrace the lack of meaning and not fill this void. Not fill this void. Sisyphus is not thinking to himself, I've found the meaning of life. The meaning of life is to roll a boulder up a mountain. It's not an escape from the absurdity of life. It's not an escape from the meaninglessness of life, but it is an embrace of the meaninglessness of life.
In the text, it says something about the conviction of a philosopher and the actions that a philosopher takes. A lot of people are so miserable. I often think that thoughts like that are so luxurious, that people can sit down and sit back and really have such, be self-reflective enough and reflective about life enough to really think so deeply about those ideas and accept that absurdity. I mean, can anyone reflect on that with me?
So maybe you're saying that absurdism is only a philosophy that need be dispensed to people who have the luxury to think about the meaninglessness of their own life. And maybe absurdism is not a philosophy that needs to be dispensed to people who are so wrapped up in the business of surviving that they don't even think about these questions.
Right.
It's like, we don't need to give an answer to people who aren't asking the questions. If you are asking the questions, here is an answer.
I would just like to place this in the debate, but I do think that there's an intrinsic right for anyone to decide not to live in this world. What happens with euthanasia? Like, how can we, is this necessarily seen as that we are avoiding the absurdism of life, or that we have an intrinsic right, and not because it's in any constitution, but an intrinsic right of deciding when do we want to leave this world or not.
Yeah. Are you specifically speaking about human euthanasia or also a non-human animal euthanasia?
I think that both would be good to debate.
It's just his idea of it's his ethical idea of individuating suffering. He's frustrated with the existentialists because he doesn't feel that they have like an ethical solution. That's my interpretation anyway. I don't think he's saying suicide is bad per se. I mean, others may disagree with me. Their interpretation of the text. If you want to live in the world, you can live in your own world, I guess, or of absurdity. It's a way of mediating the kind of the suffering and the craziness. I don't think it's like a criticization necessarily of killing yourself.
Yeah. And he would probably certainly denounce the idea of like of a universal moral order that would decree
Yeah.
suicide to be something negative.
Yeah, exactly. Because in another work of him called Happy Death, he portraying a hitman who kill people for nothing, and he just kill people because without any idea, without any reasons. The idea of that book is that the hitman should have a terrible ending, but because of the unreasonables of the universe, he still died a very happy death.
Thank you. So I see some heads turning, and I know that there are people who will probably want to address and respond. Strictly for the limitation of time and with respect to Bluebirds who's hosting us, I unfortunately do have to bring this discussion to a close. So thank you all so very much for coming tonight.